There comes a moment in some relationships that feels almost impossible to imagine while it is happening. A moment when the messages stop, the calls disappear, the checking of social media slowly fades, and two people who once occupied so much space in each other's minds suddenly enter complete silence. Not because they no longer care, not because the connection meant nothing, but because both have reached a point where continuing feels just as painful as letting go. And when an avoidant and an empath both go no contact at the same time, something unusual begins to unfold. Most people assume that silence affects only one side. They imagine one person suffering while the other moves on, one person missing while the other forgets. But reality is often far more complicated. Beneath the silence, two completely different emotional journeys begin at the exact same moment. Neither can see what the other is experiencing. Neither knows what thoughts are running through the other's mind, yet both are being changed by the absence in ways they never expected. What happens next is rarely talked about because it happens behind closed doors, inside private moments, during sleepless nights, and in conversations that never actually take place. And if you have ever wondered what truly happens when both an avoidant and an empath stop reaching out, stop chasing, and stop fighting for the connection, the answer may surprise you. The day silence begins often feels different for each person. For the empath, it can feel like standing at the edge of an emotional cliff. There is a strange emptiness where connection once lived. Even if the relationship had become exhausting, even if there had been confusion, mixed signals, or repeated disappointments, the absence still feels shocking. The empath has usually invested deeply into the connection. Their emotions became intertwined with the relationship. Their thoughts revolved around understanding, helping, supporting, and preserving the bond. When that suddenly stops, it can feel as if a part of their daily identity disappears overnight. The silence creates a void that cannot immediately be filled. For the avoidant, the first day of silence often looks very different from the outside. There may be less visible emotion, less outward reaction, less obvious grief. The distance can initially feel manageable, even necessary. After all, emotional intensity often feels overwhelming to someone who instinctively protects themselves through distance. The absence of pressure can feel calming, the absence of expectations can feel relieving. Yet what makes this stage so deceptive is that the story is only beginning. What appears to be freedom on the surface often hides emotions that have not yet fully surfaced. At first, both individuals tell themselves similar stories. They convince themselves that this is what needed to happen. They replay the arguments, the misunderstandings, the emotional exhaustion, and the moments that pushed them apart. Each finds reasons to justify the silence. Each tries to make peace with the decision. Yet underneath those explanations exists something neither person fully understands. Because when a connection has touched people deeply, silence does not instantly erase attachment. It simply changes the way attachment expresses itself. One of the most fascinating parts of no contact is that both people often believe they are finally doing the right thing. The empath reaches a point where they can no longer continue carrying the emotional weight of the relationship. They become tired of trying to create closeness that constantly slips away. They become exhausted from analyzing every interaction, searching for reassurance, and wondering where they stand. At some point, self-preservation begins speaking louder than hope. The empath realizes that continuing to chase may only deepen their wounds. For perhaps the first time, they choose themselves. They choose boundaries. At the same time, the avoidant often views no contact through an entirely different lens. Distance feels practical, necessary, sometimes even healthy. They may genuinely believe that space will reduce tension and restore emotional balance. They convince themselves that stepping away is the mature choice. They tell themselves that less emotional pressure will create clarity. In many cases, they are not intentionally trying to hurt anyone. They are trying to manage emotions in the only way they know how. And because distance has often served as a coping strategy throughout their lives, silence feels familiar. This is where an invisible paradox begins. Both people believe they are protecting themselves. Both believe they are creating peace. Both believe that stepping back is the solution. Yet neither realizes that no contact is about to reveal truths they could not see while they were still connected. The very thing that feels like an ending often becomes the beginning of a deeper emotional awakening. During the early stages of silence, the avoidant frequently experiences something that can be misunderstood by outsiders. Relief. Not because the relationship meant nothing, not because feelings were absent, but because the emotional demands that once felt overwhelming are no longer immediately present. There are no difficult conversations waiting to happen, no pressure to explain complicated emotions, no expectation to be vulnerable before they feel ready. The nervous system finally relaxes. This relief can be powerful. The avoidant may throw themselves into work, hobbies, routines, friendships, or personal goals. Life feels lighter, more manageable, more predictable. For a while, it may genuinely appear as though they have moved on effortlessly. They may even believe it themselves. The silence creates enough distance that emotional discomfort becomes easier to ignore. But relief and healing are not the same thing. And that distinction becomes important later. Because when the noise disappears, unresolved emotions do not vanish with it, they simply wait. Hidden beneath distractions, hidden beneath routines, hidden beneath the illusion that distance has solved everything. The avoidant may feel free initially, but freedom from emotional pressure is not necessarily freedom from emotional attachment. The attachment remains, it simply exists beneath conscious awareness, waiting for the moment when silence becomes long enough for deeper feelings to emerge. Meanwhile, the empath begins experiencing a very different challenge. Without the relationship consuming their attention, they are suddenly left alone with themselves. This can be surprisingly difficult. For so long, their focus may have centered on understanding another person's emotions, anticipating their needs, and trying to maintain connection. Now, there is no one to analyze, no one to rescue, no one to fix. The emotional energy that once flowed outward suddenly has nowhere to go. The first emotional withdrawal can feel overwhelming. The empath may constantly fight the urge to reach out. They may replay conversations repeatedly. They may wonder whether the other person misses them. They may question whether they made the right decision. Some days they feel strong and determined. Other days they feel consumed by longing. The silence becomes a mirror reflecting emotions they had been too busy to fully acknowledge before. What makes this stage especially painful is that the empath often discovers how much of their emotional world had become attached to the relationship itself. The absence creates cravings similar to withdrawal, not simply because they miss the person, but because they miss the role they played in that person's life. They miss feeling needed, they miss feeling connected, they miss having someone to pour their love into. And in those quiet moments, they begin confronting a difficult question: who am I when I am no longer trying to save this relationship? As the days and weeks pass, something even more unexpected begins happening. Beneath the relief, beneath the longing, beneath the explanations and justifications, grief quietly enters the picture. This is the stage neither person expects, because grief does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it waits until the silence becomes real, until hope starts fading, until both individuals realize that this separation may not be temporary after all. For the empath, grief often appears through sadness, tears, nostalgia, and emotional reflection. They begin mourning not only what happened, but what could have been. They grieve the future they imagined, the conversations that never happened, the love they hoped would eventually grow. They find themselves remembering the beautiful moments just as vividly as the painful ones. For the avoidant, grief often arrives differently. It can emerge quietly through unexpected memories, sudden feelings of emptiness, or moments when distractions stop working. A song triggers a memory, a familiar place brings back emotions. An ordinary moment suddenly feels incomplete. What they once pushed aside begins resurfacing. And because these emotions were delayed rather than processed, they can feel surprisingly intense when they finally appear. This is the hidden truth about no contact that few people understand. Silence does not instantly heal either person. It removes the distractions that once kept deeper emotions buried. And once those emotions rise to the surface, both individuals are forced to face something they had been avoiding in different ways. The reality of loss, the reality of attachment, the reality that a meaningful connection has left a permanent mark on both of their lives, even though they are separated, even though they are no longer speaking, even though neither knows what the other is feeling. Beneath the silence, two emotional journeys have already begun, and neither one is prepared for where those journeys are about to lead. The strange thing about silence is that it changes over time. In the beginning, it feels loud. Every unanswered urge to reach out feels impossible to ignore. Every day without contact feels significant, and every memory feels fresh. But eventually, the silence settles into something different. It becomes part of everyday life. The routine adjusts, the emotional storms become less frequent, and this is often the exact moment when something unexpected begins happening inside the avoidant. During the early stages of no contact, distance may have created relief. The emotional pressure that once felt overwhelming is no longer present. There are no arguments to escape, no difficult conversations waiting around the corner, and no emotional demands creating anxiety. The nervous system that once felt crowded by intensity begins calming down, and when that happens, space opens for reflection. This is when the avoidant often starts thinking about the empath far more than expected. Not necessarily every hour or in a dramatic way, but consistently enough to notice. Small reminders begin appearing everywhere. A familiar song, a shared experience, a place once visited together, or a random moment that unexpectedly triggers a memory. Unlike before, there is no active relationship distracting them from those thoughts. There is only silence. Many people assume that if an avoidant truly cared, they would immediately chase after the person they lost. But emotional reality is often more complicated. Avoidants frequently process emotions later than other people. What others feel during the relationship, they often feel after it. What others confront immediately, they sometimes confront only after enough distance has been created. The empath's absence becomes noticeable in ways the avoidant never anticipated. It is not always the grand moments they remember first. Sometimes it is the smallest things, the comforting presence during stressful days, the person who consistently checked in, remembered details others forgot, and provided emotional warmth even when they themselves struggled to receive it. What once felt ordinary suddenly feels valuable. Most surprising of all, the avoidant begins realizing that the empath is no longer available in the way they once were. That realization can be unsettling, because as long as someone remains emotionally available, there is a hidden sense of security. Even if the relationship is struggling, part of the mind assumes the connection still exists. But no contact changes that. The empath is no longer reaching out, no longer waiting, and no longer trying to bridge the emotional distance. The connection that once felt permanent suddenly feels uncertain, and for the first time the avoidant begins confronting the possibility of true loss. Meanwhile, something equally important is happening on the other side of the silence. The empath is beginning to see the relationship more clearly. At first, no contact felt unbearable because the empath was focused on what they were losing. They were grieving the connection, the memories, and the future they imagined. But with enough distance, perspective slowly starts replacing emotional overwhelm. The empath begins noticing things they could not fully see while emotionally immersed in the relationship. They start recognizing how much energy they spent trying to maintain closeness. They remember the times they ignored their own needs and accepted less than they deserved because they believed love required endless patience. They begin understanding how often they prioritized another person's emotional comfort while neglecting their own. This realization is rarely immediate. It arrives gradually. One memory leads to another, one insight leads to another, and little by little, the empath begins piecing together a more balanced picture of the relationship. For the first time, they stop viewing everything through the lens of hope. Hope had once softened every disappointment, convinced them that things would eventually change, and encouraged them to overlook warning signs because they believed the relationship was moving towards something better. But distance weakens the influence of hope, and when hope becomes quieter, clarity becomes louder. The empath begins asking difficult questions. Why was I always the one initiating difficult conversations? Why did I work so hard to maintain a connection that often felt one-sided? Why did I believe that loving someone meant carrying responsibilities that were never mine to carry? These questions can be painful because they challenge long-held beliefs, but they are also transformative. The empath slowly realizes that understanding another person's wounds does not require sacrificing their own well-being. Compassion does not require self-abandonment, and love does not require endless emotional depletion. As this understanding grows, something remarkable begins happening. The empath becomes less focused on changing the avoidant and more focused on understanding themselves. Yet even as clarity emerges, another emotional battle begins, because missing someone and missing the fantasy are not always the same thing. At first, these experiences feel identical. The pain feels identical, the longing feels identical, and the sadness feels identical. But as healing progresses, subtle differences begin revealing themselves. The empath starts remembering not only the beautiful moments, but also the difficult ones. They remember the inconsistency, the confusion, the emotional distance, and the unanswered questions. They remember how often they felt lonely while technically being in a relationship. This creates a conflict inside them. Part of them misses the person deeply, but another part begins recognizing that what they miss most may actually be the dream they attach to that person. The dream of finally feeling chosen, the dream of emotional security, and the dream that one day all the effort would pay off and the relationship would become everything they hoped it could be. When relationships involve strong emotional longing, fantasies often become intertwined with reality. The mind fills gaps with possibilities and imagines future versions of the relationship that never fully existed in the present. During no contact, separating reality from fantasy becomes one of the most important parts of healing. The avoidant experiences a similar struggle. They may find themselves missing the comfort of the connection while forgetting the emotional demands that once felt overwhelming. They may remember the empath's warmth while overlooking the challenges that existed between them. Nostalgia has a way of simplifying complex realities. Both people find themselves caught between two forms of longing for the person and longing for the version of the relationship they wished existed. Understanding the difference changes everything, because healing cannot begin fully until both people stop mourning an imagined future and start accepting what actually happened. As this internal process unfolds, another powerful shift occurs. The empath stops chasing, not temporarily, not as a strategy, and not as a test, but genuinely. This is often the moment that changes the emotional dynamic more than anything else. For a long time, the relationship may have been fueled by pursuit. The empath moved toward connection whenever distance appeared. They initiated conversations, attempted repair, searched for solutions, and carried responsibility for keeping the emotional bond alive. But eventually, exhaustion reaches a point where pursuit is no longer possible. The empath lets go. Not because the love was fake or because the memories disappear, but because survival requires it. This decision often feels heartbreaking. There is grief in accepting that effort alone cannot save a relationship. There is grief in realizing that love cannot force another person to heal, open up, or choose closeness. Yet hidden within that grief is a profound form of freedom. The empath starts reclaiming emotional energy that had been tied to the relationship for months or even years. They begin investing in themselves again. Their attention slowly shifts toward friendships, passions, personal growth, and self-discovery. They spend less time analyzing another person's behavior and more time understanding their own needs. The transformation is subtle at first, then it becomes undeniable. This is often the stage where the avoidant notices the absence most intensely because the familiar pattern has changed. The messages are not coming. The emotional availability is no longer waiting. The safety net that once existed is gone. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant experiences what the empath experienced for so long: uncertainty. They no longer know where they stand, and they no longer know whether the connection can be recovered. Uncertainty has a way of bringing buried emotions to the surface. Eventually, the avoidant encounters something they can no longer escape: emotional reality. Up until this point, distractions may have provided protection. Work, routines, hobbies, social activities, and daily responsibilities helped keep difficult feelings at a distance. But distractions are temporary. They cannot permanently suppress attachment. Sooner or later, quiet moments arrive. A late night, a lonely weekend, an unexpected memory, or a significant life event with no one to share it with. Suddenly, the emotions that were postponed begin demanding attention. The avoidant starts recognizing that losing someone is different from creating distance. Distance feels controlled. Loss does not. Distance feels temporary. Loss feels final. This realization can be deeply unsettling because it forces confrontation with emotions that were previously avoided. Regret may surface, sadness may surface, questions may surface. Could things have been different? Did I take the connection for granted? Was I protecting myself, or was I protecting my fears? For many avoidants, these questions represent a significant emotional turning point, not because they immediately know the answers, but because they are finally asking them. The walls that once felt necessary begin showing cracks. The certainty that distance would solve everything begins fading, and in its place emerges a more complicated truth. The empath was not simply a source of pressure. They were also a source of love. The relationship was not simply overwhelming, it was meaningful. The silence was not simply peaceful, it was lonely. And when these realizations arrive, they often arrive all at once. The avoidant finally encounters the emotional reality that had been waiting beneath the relief, beneath the distractions, and beneath the distance. The reality that someone mattered, the reality that their absence matters, and the reality that no contact has now changed both people in ways neither of them could have predicted when the silence first began. The reality that someone mattered, the reality that their absence matters, and the reality that no contact has now changed both people in ways neither of them could have predicted when the silence first began. As the months continue moving forward, something remarkable starts happening to the empath. At first, their healing was focused on surviving the loss. Every day felt like a struggle between holding on and letting go. Every memory seemed capable of reopening wounds. But healing has a quiet way of creating changes that are almost invisible while they are happening. One day, the empath realizes they did not think about the relationship for several hours. Then they realize they made it through an entire day without checking for messages. Then they notice they laughed freely without feeling guilty for it. Small moments like these may seem insignificant, but they mark the beginning of something powerful. The empath is starting to reclaim their identity. For so long, a large part of their emotional energy had been invested in understanding someone else. Their focus revolved around preserving the relationship, fixing problems, anticipating emotional shifts, and maintaining connection. In the process, parts of themselves had slowly moved into the background. Now those forgotten parts begin returning. Old interests resurface, personal goals regain importance, dreams that were placed on hold start demanding attention again. The empath begins reconnecting with who they were before the relationship became the center of their emotional world, and perhaps most importantly, they begin discovering who they can become after it. This stage is not about becoming cold. It is not about pretending the relationship never mattered. It is not about erasing love. It is about remembering that their entire identity was never supposed to depend on another person's ability to receive that love. For the first time in a very long time, they start feeling emotionally complete without needing constant reassurance from someone else. The validation they once searched for externally slowly begins growing from within. Their confidence strengthens, their boundaries strengthen, and their sense of self strengthens. While they may still miss the connection, they no longer feel defined by its absence. This transformation is often one of the most beautiful outcomes of no contact, because what begins as heartbreak slowly becomes self-discovery. Yet at the very same time this healing is unfolding, something curious begins happening to both the empath and the avoidant. The memories become stronger. This surprises many people because they assume memories should fade with distance. In some ways they do. Certain details become blurry. Specific conversations become harder to recall. But emotionally significant memories often grow more vivid. A single moment can suddenly feel larger than life. A simple conversation can replay repeatedly in the mind. A random memory can appear without warning and bring back emotions that feel as fresh as they did months ago. There is a reason for this. When a relationship ends, the mind naturally begins searching for meaning. It reviews experiences, revisits emotional landmarks, and tries to understand what happened and why. As a result, memories often become emotionally amplified. The empath may find themselves remembering the moments when they felt most connected, the rare moments of vulnerability, the moments that gave them hope, and the moments that convinced them the relationship was worth fighting for. The avoidant often experiences something similar. They may suddenly remember acts of kindness they once overlooked, conversations they did not fully appreciate at the time, and moments when someone stood beside them despite their emotional walls. The mind begins highlighting experiences that once seemed ordinary, and that can be deeply emotional because people often fail to understand the value of something until it is no longer available. The danger during this stage is that memories can become selective. The empath may remember only the beautiful moments and temporarily forget the emotional pain. The avoidant may remember only the comfort and temporarily forget the reasons they created distance. Nostalgia can create powerful illusions. It can convince people that the relationship was perfect. It can make the past appear simpler than it really was. It can transform complexity into longing. That is why this stage feels so emotionally intense, because both individuals are wrestling not only with memories, but with the meaning attached to those memories. Eventually, those memories lead both people toward a moment few discuss openly. A turning point, a moment that quietly changes everything. This turning point often arrives unexpectedly. There is no announcement, no dramatic event, and no clear beginning. Instead, it emerges during an ordinary moment when one realization finally settles into place. The relationship may truly be over. Until this point, some part of both individuals often remains attached to possibility. Even during no contact, there may be a hidden belief that reconciliation could happen tomorrow. There may be an unconscious assumption that the story is unfinished. But eventually, reality becomes impossible to avoid. Time continues passing. Life continues moving forward. The silence continues existing, and both people begin confronting the possibility that this separation may not be temporary. This realization can be devastating. Even if no contact was necessary, even if the relationship was unhealthy, and even if both people agreed distance was the right decision, accepting finality is painful because finality forces people to let go of imagined futures. The empath mourns the future they hoped would eventually arrive. The avoidant mourns possibilities they may not have fully appreciated until they were gone. Both experience a unique form of grief, not grief for what happened, but grief for what will never happen. The conversations that will never take place, the memories that will never be created, and the versions of themselves that existed only within the context of that relationship. This is the crossroads where many people experience their deepest emotional pain, yet it is also where genuine transformation begins. Because acceptance creates a choice: continue living in the past or begin building a future. Once that choice appears, both individuals begin changing in profound ways. For the avoidant, this often marks the beginning of a deeper internal transformation. Before no contact, many of their emotional strategies may have operated automatically. Distance felt natural. Withdrawal felt safe. Avoidance felt protective. But now something has changed. The emotional consequences have become impossible to ignore. The silence has revealed truths that distractions could not hide. The avoidant begins recognizing patterns they previously overlooked. They start noticing how often fear influenced their decisions, how often vulnerability felt threatening, and how often emotional closeness triggered discomfort. Perhaps most importantly, they begin questioning whether those protective strategies actually protected them at all. Because while avoidance may have reduced short-term discomfort, it may also have cost them meaningful connection. This realization can be incredibly difficult. Few things are harder than recognizing that the walls built for protection may also have become prisons. The avoidant starts exploring emotions with greater honesty. They become more aware of their fears, more aware of their wounds, and more aware of the ways those wounds shape their relationships. For some, this becomes the beginning of tremendous growth, not because they suddenly become different overnight, but because awareness creates possibility. The moment someone sees a pattern clearly, that pattern no longer controls them in the same way. Slowly, the avoidant begins developing a deeper relationship with vulnerability. They start understanding that emotional closeness is not weakness, that dependence and connection are not the same thing, that love requires risk, that intimacy requires courage, and that being known by another person is uncomfortable precisely because it matters. These lessons are rarely learned easily, but they often emerge through loss. Meanwhile, the empath is undergoing a transformation of their own, and in many ways it is just as profound. For much of the relationship, their growth may have been focused outward, understanding others, supporting others, and helping others heal. Now that focus begins turning inward. The empath starts asking questions they may never have asked before. Why did I ignore my own needs for so long? Why did I equate love with sacrifice? Why was I willing to carry burdens that were never mine to carry? These questions lead to powerful discoveries. The empath begins realizing that empathy without boundaries can become self-abandonment, that compassion without self-respect can become self-neglect, and that love without reciprocity can become emotional exhaustion. This understanding changes everything because the empath is no longer learning how to love another person. They are learning how to love themselves. For many empaths, this is one of the most challenging lessons of all. They learn that their value does not increase when they save someone. Their worth does not depend on being needed. Their identity does not depend on fixing broken relationships. They are worthy simply because they exist. This realization creates freedom. The freedom to choose relationships rather than chase them. The freedom to set boundaries without guilt. The freedom to walk away from situations that repeatedly diminish their well-being. And perhaps most importantly, the freedom to receive the same love they have always been willing to give. As these transformations unfold separately, something extraordinary becomes clear. The people who entered no contact are not the same people who now stand on the other side of it. The avoidant has been forced to confront emotional realities they once avoided. The empath has been forced to rediscover parts of themselves they once neglected. Both have suffered. Both have grown. Both have changed. And although neither can see the other's journey, both are moving through a process that is reshaping their understanding of love, loss, connection, and themselves. The silence that once felt like an ending has quietly become a teacher, a difficult teacher, a painful teacher, but a teacher nonetheless. And what it is preparing them for next may be the most surprising stage of the entire journey. As time passes, both the empath and the avoidant begin healing in ways they never expected. The empath slowly stops obsessing over the relationship, starts focusing on themselves again, and begins rediscovering their confidence, identity, and sense of worth. At the same time, the avoidant starts becoming more aware of the emotions and fears they once avoided. Although neither person realizes it, both are growing separately and becoming stronger as individuals. This healing often creates a new challenge, the temptation to reach out. Memories remain, feelings still exist, and both may wonder whether things could be different now. From here, two futures become possible: permanent separation or reconnection. Sometimes growth reveals that the relationship was never meant to continue, allowing both people to move forward with peace and wisdom. Other times, genuine growth creates the possibility of a healthier relationship built on self-awareness, vulnerability, and emotional responsibility. However, reconnection depends not on love alone, but on real personal growth. No contact ultimately teaches a deeper lesson. It is not about getting someone back, but about finding yourself. The empath learns that love should never require self-sacrifice, while the avoidant learns that emotional distance cannot replace true connection. In the end, the greatest success of no contact is not whether two people reunite, but whether they become whole on their own. Because when that happens, love is no longer driven by fear, validation, or dependency. It becomes a choice made from strength, self-respect, and genuine emotional freedom.